Chapter 8 Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice by Philip Hoos. As you know, a review of Chapter 7 So our quote at the beginning of Chapter 8 comes from W.A. Tacky Gale, the mayor of Montgomery. We are going to hold our stand. We are not going to be a part of any program that will get Negroes to ride the buses again at the price of the destruction of our heritage and way of life. Second front, second chance. With the turn of the new year of 1956, Montgomery throbbed with excitement. Day by day, reporters and photographers poured into town to cover the Negro bus protest in the heart of Dixie. As the boycott entered its second month, Black leaders continued to press for the same 3 modest changes that Joanne Robinson and others had requested 2 years earlier, which did not include integrated seating. But officials wouldn't budge. Give them an inch and they'll take a mile, they told one another. The City Lines Bus Company declared the proposed changes illegal, and said that unfortunately their hands were tied. Members of the Montgomery Black community gather at the Holt Street Baptist Church in support of the boycott. Mass meetings continued at Black churches every Tuesday and Thursday night. Young, round-faced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who urged boycotters to refrain from violence and seek charity towards whites in their hearts, inspired crowds with stirring speeches that often included ideas and philosophies from distant times and places. He talked about the power of love to change the world. He had poetry in his voice, and he could snatch scripture out of the air and make it hum, said E.D. Nixon, who admitted he was saying it better than I ever could. King began to emerge as a charismatic national figure. Determined to apply economic pressure peacefully, Black protesters let the nearly empty buses rumble on by like green ghosts, ignoring the doors that snapped open invitingly at the corners, and devised their own transportation system. Coached by leaders of Baton Rouge's bus boycott of 1953, the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, designed an alternative to the buses on the scale of a wartime military transport system, moving tens of thousands of maids and yardmen and clerks and students around Montgomery's far-flung neighborhoods every day. And it was entirely voluntary. It ran on dedication, generosity, and hope. So, the Montgomery Improvement Association. The leaders believed that a new organization was needed to run the boycott, so they created the Montgomery Improvement Association. Determined to avoid friction between established Black leaders, they nominated as president a newcomer, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Well, if you think I can render some service, I will, he replied. A board of 25 directors was named. After thousands voted to continue the boycott beyond one day, the MIA had a lot of work to do. They had to design the carpool, put it in motion, and pay for it. Mass meetings were held twice a week to keep spirits up and collect donations. As the boycott rolled on, donations poured in from all over the country, eventually enough for the MIA to buy more than 30 station wagons. Some teens organized their social lives around the mass meetings. Annie Larkin, then 16, recalls, I'd go home from school and get my homework done, and my grandmother would have dinner ready so my aunt and I could go to the mass meetings together. I went every Tuesday and Thursday night, no matter where. The MIA network was unveiled in detail at a mass meeting on December 12th. There would be 42 morning pickup stations and 48 evening stations scattered throughout Montgomery. These points had been carefully plotted on maps by mail carriers, the workers who knew the city the best. The central dispatch station would be a Black-owned downtown parking lot manned by an on-call transportation committee. The buses would be a giant carpool consisting of ordinary people's automobiles. Car owners were asked to lend their vehicles to the MIA carpool so that other people could drive them around town. For most people, especially if they had a little money, having a car was a proud symbol of status. Letting total strangers drive one's car around all day was a hard thing to ask, but nearly 200 people turned over their keys to the boycott. Here's how it worked. A maid needing to get across town to her white employer's home would walk to the morning station nearest her home and wait for a ride. After work, she would walk to the nearest night station to be picked up and driven to a drop-off point near her home. Since it was against the law for private cars to charge fares like licensed taxis, the network would be paid for by donations collected at the mass meetings. Most of the rides would be free. Though the network was elegantly designed, there were not enough seats in the carpool to replace an entire city bus system. Thousands of black workers, including many who were elderly and some who were disabled, set out from home in the pre-dawn darkness and walked miles each day. Some preferred to walk to show their support for the boycott rather than accept a ride, even from the MIA carpool. One MIA driver told the story of having come upon an elderly woman hobbling along the road. "Jump in, grandmother," he said to her, pushing open the door. She waved him on. "I'm not walking for myself," she said. "I'm walking for my children and my grandchildren." Family members made enormous sacrifices and sometimes hobbled home with barely enough energy to eat supper, and family chores like shopping had to continue. That meant more steps. The foot-weary warriors told their stories at the mass meetings, inspiring and encouraging one another to keep walking. Many were initially skeptical of the boycott. When they first sent the leaflet saying, "Don't ride the bus," "I was worried about my mama," remembers Aline Bowser. "I got angry and I said they'd better not do anything to her. I thought she'd still go on riding the bus because she did house cleaning and she worked far away from home. But then they had worked out this whole plan of having people to drive and pick up. I got behind it. I and 3 other girls from my typing class at school started working at the Baptist Center, typing up and mimeographing lists of the people who were driving in the bus boycott. We had to make the list every 3rd night in order to keep the information current. They had stations downtown. Who was driving this direction and that direction? I had to call the drivers and make sure they were still willing and available. And people in most families had walking jobs. I was appointed to walk downtown and pay our bills, but I could use the network for that too. So now this is an interesting image. Boycott supporters climb out of one of the dozens of station wagons that were purchased during the 381-day protest. Many of the vehicles were assigned to churches. So they bought upwards of 38 station wagons, and that image is one of the station wagons that they purchased. Claudette. When I got back to Montgomery, of course, I stayed off the buses. Mostly I rode with my mom in a used Plymouth Dad bought for her. She needed it because she worked way up out of town in a place the carpool didn't go. Dad was very frugal. He saved enough to buy a TV set too, so we could keep up with the boycott. We'd watch the news every other night. The boycott was always the headline. It was the biggest story in the South. I also read Joanne Robinson's editorials in a little newsletter. So this is QP, Claudette's dad, and this is the car he purchased for the family during the boycott so that Claudette's mother could drive herself to her place of employment because it was not within the voluntary transportation system route. The people Mom worked for were sympathetic to the boycott. The first sign of this was they didn't fire Mom when they found out I was arrested. They weren't rich. They were just average people. They paid my mom $3 a day and a bus fare. The lady used to bring her home after work on days when Mom didn't drive. The boycott was relatively easy for people on King Hill because we already had our own community transportation system in place. We were isolated. Just 3 little streets on top of a hill on the edge of town. We had no stores up there, so we had to go through white neighborhoods to shop downtown. To get off the hill, 3 or 4 people would pitch in to pay someone a quarter to drive them to and from work. They'd drop the maids off house by house because everybody was going in the same direction. My family duties increased during the boycott. Mom was gone a lot because she used her car to drive people places. We didn't donate our Plymouth to the boycott because Mom needed it to get out of town for work, but since we had a car, people were constantly coming around to say, "Mary Ann, can you take me and a couple of others to this place or that?" Dad didn't drive and I didn't have a license yet, so I did more cooking and cleaning and shopping and laundry while Mom drove. I had several cousins who drove taxis, and they'd come and take me to town when I wanted. A lot of people volunteered their cars for the boycott and dipped into their savings to buy gasoline during that time. Everyone pulled together. So white support of the boycott. Not all white Montgomeryans opposed the boycott, and not all favored racial segregation. A small but determined minority of white citizens assisted the carpool, drove their black employees to and from work, and sometimes donated money to the boycott. Among the best known were Robert Gratz, the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church, and Clifford Durr, a lawyer who assisted Fred Gray in his legal cases. His wife, Virginia Durr, also provided support in many ways. A few whites dared to express their support publicly. Juliette Morgan, a librarian, wrote in a letter to the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, "It is hard not to be moved with admiration at the quiet dignity, discipline, and dedication with which the Negroes have conducted their boycott." The death threats began immediately, by phone and mail. They increased month by month. People hurled stones at Morgan's picture window and sprinted up to ring her doorbell again and again in the dead of night, shattering her sleep. She lost many friends. About a year after her letter was published, Juliette Morgan took her own life. I went to the mass meetings when they were at churches on the other side of town where people wouldn't recognize me. I went to a lot of them, more than once a month. I heard Dr. King speak and felt the people rally around him. Those speeches he made just brought out everything you wanted to say to a white person. People were kicking you when you were down every day, and his words made you feel stronger. I sat in the back, far away from the speechmakers, wearing big shirts to cover my growing stomach. The leaders sure weren't going to invite a pregnant teenager up on stage during a mass meeting. It bothered me to be shunned, but I was an unwed pregnant girl, and I knew how people were. People who recognized me would ask, "Who's the father?" I'd answer, "None of your business."